Today's mindful moment. Okay, so get this. Millions of people in the U.S., one of the richest countries in the world, right, are living on less than $4 a day. It's a statistic that kind of just stopped me in my tracks. We're talking about a level of poverty comparable to developing nations right here in the land of opportunity.
Yeah, it is a jarring reality, and it really challenges, I think, our assumptions about poverty in America.
hmm
But luckily, we have Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America to help us unpack this.
Right. We're doing a deep dive into this book, along with some of Desmond's other works and research he mentions, to really understand why poverty persists in a nation as wealthy as ours.
Yeah, Desmond, he argues that it's not simply a lack of resources.
Yeah.
In fact, he points out that the U.S. economy is a powerhouse. The issue, he says, is more about systems of exploitation and a lack of choice for those who are struggling to make ends meet.
Okay, so let's unpack this leaky bucket analogy he uses. So he's saying that even when money is allocated to anti-poverty programs,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily reach those in need.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You're trying to fill a bucket with water, but there are holes in it. So some of that water, those resources, are lost along the way due to inefficiencies in the system, bureaucratic hurdles, or even exploitation by those who are supposed to be helping.
So it's not just that the system isn't working efficiently, but that it's actively working against those that it's meant to help. That's a pretty bleak picture.
It is. And Desmond really brings this home with the story of Crystal Mayberry, a single mother in Milwaukee who's evicted from her home and forced to rely on shelters. Her experience highlights how these systems, the ones that are supposed to provide a safety net, can actually make things worse.
Crystal's story is heartbreaking,
Mm-hmm.
and it really makes you wonder about the whole idea of welfare dependency. Is it really as widespread as some people believe?
Desmond challenges that myth head on. He found that many families who are eligible for assistance don't even apply.
Why wouldn't they apply if they need the help?
Well, he found it's often due to the incredibly complex application processes, the fear of stigma, or simply a lack of awareness about what's available.
That's so frustrating. They need help. The help exists, but they can't access it. But on the flip side, Desmond points out that there's a whole other segment of society benefiting from government programs, but they're not labeled as dependent.
Right. He's talking about what he calls welfare for the rich. Things like tax breaks for corporations and wealthy individuals often get a pass, even though they divert significant resources away from public services. That could benefit everyone, especially those struggling to get by.
It feels like a double standard, right? One group is scrutinized for needing help, while another benefits immensely. But it's framed as something else entirely.
Yeah, and this is where Desmond's argument gets really interesting. He says we need to shift our focus from targeted aid to empowering choice and dismantling systems of exploitation.
Okay, so let's dive into those systems. He starts with the labor market, right? It feels like wages have been stagnant for decades, and things like union-busting tactics and the rise of the gig economy haven't exactly helped.
He paints a pretty stark picture of how the labor market exploits those who are most vulnerable. For example, he talks about how in many states, restaurant workers are still paid a sub-minimum wage and rely on tips to survive. He even traces this practice back to slavery.
Wow, that's a historical connection I never would have made.
Right.
So it's not just about low wages, but a system built on a history of exploitation.
Exactly. And it's not just restaurants. He talks about how corporations have found ways to depress wages even further through things like fissuring the workplace. It's basically where companies farm out positions to independent contractors to avoid paying benefits and providing basic worker protections.
So you have people working for these massive companies,
Mm-hmm.
doing essential jobs, but they're treated like they're disposable.
That's the idea. And then there are these non-compete clauses, which were originally meant to protect intellectual property, but now they're being used to prevent low-wage workers from seeking better opportunities.
So even the hope of upward mobility is being restricted. It sounds like a system designed to keep people stuck.
That's what Desmond argues, and he points out that the decline of unions has only made things worse. Unions used to be a powerful force for worker empowerment, fighting for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. But their power has been eroded, leaving workers with fewer options for advocating for their rights.
It's interesting because you often hear the argument that unions stifle economic growth, but Desmond seems to be saying the opposite.
He actually cites studies showing that unions can boost productivity and reduce turnover, which benefits both workers and companies. He argues that weakening labor power hasn't led to the promised economic benefits, but instead has created greater inequality.
It all circles back to that leaky bucket, doesn't it? Even programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, while well-intentioned, can end up subsidizing corporations that pay poverty wages.
Exactly. And Desmond doesn't shy away from calling out specific companies like Walmart that have supported the EITC while simultaneously fighting against minimum wage increases. It highlights this inherent conflict within the system.
Yeah, it makes you think about the role we play as consumers. If we're supporting companies that exploit their workers, are we part of the problem?
Desmond raises that very question, and he challenges us to think about the poverty impact of our purchasing decisions. Just like we consider the environmental impact of our choices, he's urging us to think about the people behind the products we buy. Are they being paid a living wage? Do they have access to benefits? Are they able to organize and advocate for their rights?
It's a lot to consider, but it's an important point. We can't ignore the human cost of the things we buy. And speaking of human cost, Desmond doesn't stop with the labor market. He goes on to explore how other systems, like housing and banking, contribute to the exploitation of the poor.
He argues that high rents aren't just a reflection of market forces, but a result of landlords taking advantage of people with limited choices. Think of Crystal Mayberry again, forced to pay exorbitant rent for substandard housing because she has nowhere else to go.
It feels like a trap, doesn't it? You need a place to live.
Yeah.
But the very act of finding a place to live can put you in a financially precarious situation.
And Desmond goes on to talk about how predatory lending practices in the banking system can trap people in a cycle of debt. He gives this devastating example of his friend, Wu, who lost his lower leg because he couldn't afford to treat a minor injury.
That's horrifying. It's a stark reminder that poverty isn't just about lacking money. It's about lacking access to basic necessities like healthcare.
And he connects Wu's story to the broader issue of healthcare access and how the lack of affordable options for the poor can have devastating consequences.
So we've got this trifecta of exploitation: the labor market, the housing market, and the banking system, all working together to keep people trapped in poverty.
That's what Desmond is arguing. And he's calling for a systemic overhaul. He doesn't just want to tweak the existing systems. He wants to create something fundamentally different.
We were talking about some pretty bleak realities: how the labor market, the housing market, and the banking system can create a cycle of exploitation that makes it incredibly difficult to escape poverty.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. And I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking, okay, this is depressing, but what can we actually do about it?
Right, and that's where Desmond's book gets really interesting. He doesn't leave us in despair. He actually offers a lot of solutions. But before we jump into those, I think it's important to understand a key concept he introduces: the idea of hoarding opportunity.
Hoarding opportunity. That sounds intriguing. What does he mean by that?
So he argues that the wealthy don't just benefit from a skewed economic system, they actively work to create and maintain systems that give them an unfair advantage, effectively hoarding opportunities that could benefit everyone.
Can you give me some examples of how this plays out in real life? Sure, he points to things like exclusionary zoning practices. You know, those rules that limit the construction of affordable housing in affluent neighborhoods.
So it's not just that affordable housing doesn't exist, it's that it's being actively prevented from existing in certain areas.
Exactly. And this has a ripple effect. It keeps low-income families concentrated in certain neighborhoods, often with fewer resources, lower quality schools, and limited job opportunities. It's about controlling access, not just to housing, but to opportunity itself.
Right, so it sounds like he's saying that inequality isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of the system. It's a feature, not a bug.
That's a great way to put it. He's arguing that inequality is a deliberate consequence of choices made by those in power.
Okay, so how do we break this cycle of hoarding opportunity? I know Desmond is a big proponent of empowering the poor. What does that look like in practice?
Well, he talks about moving beyond the traditional model of targeted aid, which he argues can often create dependency and stigma. He wants to see systems that enable people to make choices that lift them out of poverty, not just keep them afloat.
I like that, empowering choice rather than fostering dependence. So what are some concrete examples of how we can empower choice?
Well, in the labor market, he talks about things like raising the minimum wage, strengthening worker protections, and exploring new models of worker empowerment that go beyond traditional unions. He even suggests that the government could provide small dollar loans as an alternative to predatory payday lenders.
It sounds like he's advocating for a system where hard work is actually rewarded.
Yep.
And where people aren't punished for being poor.
Exactly. He also talks a lot about expanding access to affordable housing. He's a big proponent of public housing, but recognizes that it has a negative image in the U.S.
Yeah, you often hear people say that public housing is a failed experiment.
Right, and he challenges that perception. By highlighting successful examples of public housing projects that provide safe, affordable, and dignified housing for low-income families.
So it's not that public housing is inherently flawed. It's that we haven't always done it well.
That's his argument. He also suggests expanding programs that help renters become homeowners. He points out that many people could afford mortgage payments, but are excluded from homeownership because of things like discriminatory lending practices and the difficulty of getting a mortgage for a lower-priced home.
That makes sense. Homeownership is often seen as a pathway to building wealth. But that path isn't equally accessible to everyone.
And this brings us back to that idea of empowering choice. Desmond is advocating for a system that creates more pathways out of poverty, not just safety nets to catch people when they fall.
I'm starting to see a common thread here. It's about dismantling systems that trap people and replacing them with systems that create opportunities. It's not just about giving people handouts. It's about giving them a real chance to succeed.
You're getting it. And Desmond doesn't stop there. He argues that true poverty abolition requires a deeper societal shift, a move away from the scarcity mindset towards a vision of shared prosperity.
Right. That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? To move away from this idea that there's not enough to go around and that we all have to fight for our piece of the pie.
He's challenging us to rethink our fundamental assumptions about wealth and poverty. What if, instead of seeing poverty as an individual failing, we started seeing it as a collective responsibility? What if, instead of hoarding opportunity, we started sharing it?
It's a powerful concept, but it also feels daunting. How do we even begin to shift our mindset as a society?
Desmond acknowledges that it's a long-term project, but he believes it starts with changing the way we talk about poverty. He points to the example of tax cuts. They're often framed as a way to stimulate the economy, but in reality, they disproportionately benefit the wealthy, leading to what he calls private opulence and public squalor.
So the rich get richer, invest more in private goods and services, and public institutions like schools, parks, and public transportation are left to crumble. And who suffers the most from that? The poor.
Exactly. And this isn't just a theoretical concept. He points to the tax revolt in California in the 1970s with Proposition 13. It capped property taxes, benefiting wealthy homeowners. But it also led to drastic cuts in public school funding.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? The very people who benefit most from government programs are the ones who are most opposed to government spending, particularly on programs that benefit the poor.
And Desmond argues that this disconnect is fueled by a misperception of who actually benefits from government programs. He cites studies showing that most Americans, regardless of income level, have relied on some form of government assistance at some point in their lives.
It's like we've been conditioned to see government assistance as something shameful, rather than a necessary support system for everyone.
He's calling for a more honest conversation about the role of government in our lives and how we can create a system that benefits everyone, not just the privileged few.
And this brings us back to that idea of shared prosperity. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, and that a society that allows millions to live in poverty is a society that ultimately harms us all.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of Desmond's argument, the need for racial justice. He argues that you can't talk about poverty in America without talking about race.
That makes sense. You can't ignore the historical and systemic factors that have led to disproportionate rates of poverty among Black and brown communities.
He points out that Black and Hispanic Americans are twice as likely to be poor as white Americans, and he argues that this disparity is not just a result of historical injustices, but also of ongoing discrimination in areas like housing, employment, and education.
So it's not just about addressing poverty, it's about addressing the systemic racism that fuels poverty.
He's urging us to be more than just allies. He wants us to be accomplices in the fight for racial justice, recognizing that our liberation is bound up with the liberation of those who are most marginalized.
It's a powerful call to action. And it makes me wonder what concrete steps we can take as individuals to dismantle these systems of oppression.
Well, that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Desmond offers a lot of concrete suggestions for how we can all contribute to the fight for poverty abolition, both in our own lives and in the world around us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into poverty in America. You know, we've been unpacking Matthew Desmond's argument that poverty is less about a lack of resources and more about systems designed to extract wealth from those who can least afford it.
Yeah, and we've been talking about the need for a major shift in mindset, moving away from the scarcity mindset and embracing a vision of shared prosperity.
Right, it's a powerful idea. But I'm wondering how we translate that into tangible action. Where do we even begin to dismantle these? deeply entrenched systems.
Well, Desmond offers a lot of concrete suggestions, but one of the most striking images he uses is that of tearing down walls, both literal and metaphorical.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this idea of tearing down walls.
So he argues that the physical walls that segregate our communities are a major factor in perpetuating poverty and inequality. Think about it. Affluent communities often use zoning laws and other tactics to prevent the construction of affordable housing in their neighborhoods.
So it's not just that affordable housing is scarce,
Yeah.
but that it's intentionally being kept out of certain areas.
Exactly. And this creates concentrated pockets of poverty, denying low-income families access to better schools, safer environments, and greater economic opportunities. It's about controlling access, not just to housing, but to opportunity itself.
Right? It's like we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, keeping people trapped in poverty by denying them access to the very things that could help them escape it.
Desmond, he challenges the common argument that integrated communities would lead to declining property values or compromised school quality. In fact, he cites studies that show the opposite, that children from low-income families who attend schools in more affluent neighborhoods actually perform better academically.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if some of these arguments against affordable housing are really just veiled attempts to maintain the status quo, to keep resources and opportunities concentrated among the already privileged.
That's a question Desmond wants us to grapple with. He argues that integrated communities don't just benefit those who are struggling economically, they benefit everyone. They foster greater understanding, empathy, and social cohesion.
So tearing down these walls isn't just about fairness. It's about creating a better society for all of us.
Precisely. Desmond reminds us that for much of American history, working-class white communities and communities of color were pitted against each other, which prevented the formation of a united front against economic exploitation.
Right, it's like the classic divide and conquer strategy, keeping people fighting amongst themselves so they don't challenge the power structures that keep them down.
And Desmond argues that racism and segregation have been used as tools to weaken the power of working-class movements and allow the wealthy to maintain their grip on power and resources.
It's a sobering thought. But it also makes me think that if we can break down these divisions, if we can start to see each other as allies rather than competitors, we could actually create a powerful force for change.
That's the hope that Desmond offers. He challenges us to reject this divisive narrative and embrace a vision of shared prosperity, one that recognizes that we are all interconnected and that our well-being is dependent on the well-being of others.
Okay, so we're starting to see how these different pieces fit together. Empowering choice, dismantling systems of exploitation, tearing down walls, embracing shared prosperity. It's a big vision. But I'm still wondering about those concrete steps we can take as individuals. What can we actually do to make a difference?
Well, Desmond offers a lot of practical suggestions, but I think they all boil down to a few key actions. Become a conscious consumer. Think about the poverty impact of your choices. Support businesses that pay living wages and treat their workers fairly. Invest in organizations that are working to dismantle poverty and inequality. Advocate for policies that promote shared prosperity, things like affordable housing, universal health care, and a living wage. And challenge the narratives that perpetuate poverty and racism in your own circles, in your family, your community, and your workplace.
I like that. It's not just about changing policies. It's about changing the culture, the way we think and talk about these issues.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about building a movement for change, connecting with others who share this vision of a just and equitable society.
Desmond is reminding us that we are not powerless in the face of poverty, that we all have a role to play in creating a better world. It's about changing our mindset, shifting our focus from scarcity to abundance, and recognizing that we have the power to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
He's calling for a collective awakening, a recognition that our fate is intertwined, and that we are all better off when everyone has the chance to succeed.
His vision is incredibly inspiring, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that this work is going to be challenging, maybe even uncomfortable at times. We're talking about dismantling deeply ingrained systems of power and privilege, and that's never easy.
You're absolutely right. But Desmond's message is ultimately one of hope and agency. He believes that change is possible if we are willing to fight for it, to have those difficult conversations, to challenge the status quo, and to build a movement for a more just and equitable world.
And that's what makes Poverty by America such a powerful and important book. It doesn't just diagnose the problem. It offers a path forward, a vision of a future where poverty is not an inevitability, but a relic of the past.
He's inviting us to join him in this project, to embrace the challenge of poverty abolition and to work towards a future where everyone has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and abundance.
It's a vision worth fighting for. And I, for one, am ready to do my part. What about you? What will you do to tear down the walls and build a more just and equitable America?
If you're looking for resources or ways to get involved, be sure to check out Matthew Desmond's website, as well as organizations like the Eviction Lab, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and local community groups fighting for economic justice.
That's it for this deep dive. But the conversation doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world. Until next time.
Make sure to subscribe to the deep dive and share this episode with your friends. We're constantly exploring new and challenging ideas, things that make you question what you think you know.
And we've included a purchase link for the book in the show notes, just for you. Keep those minds sharp and never stop questioning. Until next time.